Center for African Studies.
The Africa Policy Journal.
On behalf of the Harvard African Law Association and the Africa Policy Journal, I am delighted to welcome you to this panel discussion on human rights in Zimbabwe and Cameroon. Today, we are hosting two passionate advocates in the struggle for human rights on our beloved continent. First, Jestina Mukoko is here. She's a prominent human rights activist in Zimbabwe who currently serves as director of the Zimbabwe Peace Project. In 2008, she was unlawfully abducted and detained for several months before pressures from prominent world figures, including Gordon Brown, former US President Jimmy Carter, and Condoleezza Rice, led to a release by the autocratic regime of the late Robert Mugabe. In 2010, Jestina Mukoko was awarded the prestigious US State Department's International Women of Courage Award. Jestina, it's an honor to have you among us. We are also joined by Ilaria Allegrozzi. Ilaria is the senior Central Africa researcher at Human Rights Watch, focusing primarily on Cameroon. Prior to joining Human Rights Watch, she worked as senior researcher for Amnesty International, using open source investigation techniques to shed light on conflict-related abuses in Cameroon, Chad, and the Central African Republic. Ilaria has lived on the continent of Africa for more than 15 years. Ilaria, thank you for joining us. First, a general question to both of you. Could you please introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about the work that you do within the human rights space, the human rights advocacy space? So I will start with Ilaria.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, let me thank you for inviting me. Let me thank the Harvard Law Association for organizing this very important discussion. It's an honor for me to speak before you today, and especially along with Jestina Mukoko, who is such an inspiring woman and human rights defender. I have great respect and admiration for. As you said, I am currently the Human Rights Watch senior researcher on Cameroon and West Africa, mostly Guinea, and to a less extent Côte d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast. I was hired by Human Rights Watch last year to work primarily on Central Africa, Cameroon, and Central African Republic, but I am currently switching to West Africa, especially to cover issues related to the upcoming elections, both in Guinea and in Ivory Coast. I am Italian by nationality. I was born in the beautiful city of Rome, and I have been studying in Rome and in Northern Ireland, Belfast, which is a great place to study human rights, I think. And since my master in human rights and international humanitarian law, I have been working in the human rights sector, mostly as a humanitarian worker across Africa, and in the past 5-6 years as a human rights researcher for Amnesty and Human Rights Watch. I currently cover mostly Cameroon, which people say is my obsession, and I hope we're gonna have some interesting discussion about the situation unfolding in the country, across the country in the different regions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilaria. I can confirm that we do share that obsession, the two of us. I can ask Jestina now to jump in if you want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the work you do. That'll be very much appreciated.
Thank you so much, and thanks for inviting me. I'm honored to be on this panel and also to share a platform with Ilaria. I'm also keen to learn a bit about Cameroon. My name is Jestina Mukoko, as you have said. I am Zimbabwean, working from Zimbabwe. I am the National Director of the Zimbabwe Peace Project, which is an organization that monitors and documents human rights abuses. And we also do community peace building. I am also the current chairperson of the Zimbabwe Human Rights NGO Forum, which is a network of 20 human rights organizations that set the human rights agenda in the country. And as you have already said, as a result of the work that I'm doing with the Zimbabwe Peace Project, which is monitoring and documenting human rights abuses using a unique model of monitors dotted throughout the country at both constituency and district level, will give us information about what is happening at the local level. We have also been on the receiving end of state-sponsored abuse in 2008, when I and two other colleagues were abducted, kept incommunicado, tortured, and then accused of wanting to overthrow the government. I think I am a Zimbabwean who loves her country, and I think this is why I'm involved in looking at breaches of peace, which is the work that I do. And I think for now, that will be all in terms of my introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Jestina. Once again, it's a pleasure to have you and Ilaria on this program. Both Zimbabwe and Cameroon are facing very serious crises and conflicts. So I'm going to start with you, Jestina. Could you please tell us a little bit about the 2020 protests in Zimbabwe and the government's response? Much has been said about, I think a couple of years ago, when the current president came into power, there was there was at least a hope that there would be a better track record in terms of respect for human rights in the country. Do you feel that to any extent that has been reflected in the way the government has responded to the recent wave of protests in the country?
Thank you very much for that question. Indeed, a lot of Zimbabweans had expectations. I am looking at Zimbabweans on the 18th of November 2017, when they took to the streets to demand the resignation of the late Robert Mugabe. And I'm also seeing Zimbabweans in the National Sports Stadium on November 24, 2017, when the current president was inaugurated to take over from the late president. The expectation of Zimbabweans was palpable. People really had high hopes. They thought that they had come round the corner and they expected things to change. Unfortunately, things have not changed. We still find ourselves in a continuing crisis. And as you speak about the 2020 protests, I think this was in line with Zimbabweans saying, I think suffering of the vulnerable had reached a level that could not be tolerated anymore. People being concerned about the endemic corruption that was going on. A number of journalists, investigative journalists, had lifted a lead on the corruption that was going on, sadly involving monies that were supposed to be used to deal with the global pandemic that was also affecting Zimbabwe. And as I'm speaking, the person who was the Minister of Health at the time was actually fired. He has got a case before the courts, but he was not detained. He was admitted to bail. Surprisingly, one of the journalists who lifted the lead on this corruption was arrested, denied bail several times, spent about 45 days in detention, and that's Hopewell Chingono. And the other journalist, Mdudu Zimatutu, had actually to go into hiding for fear of what could happen to him. But I think what then happened was that his relatives, some of them were arrested, and one of his relatives was abducted. And one of the organizers of this, the one who mooted the idea of the July 31 protests, Jacob Ngarivume, was also arrested the same day that Hopewell Chingono was arrested. He also spent 45 days in jail. And I think this really, I would not say was the beginning of protests in 2020, because we had several months of healthcare workers downing their tools as they demanded decent ways of working, and also being provided with personal protective equipment, which is necessary when you're having to deal with the coronavirus. Some of them had to be arrested. Some of them were fired from work. But I think the people who suffered the most out of this is the common men in the street, who could not afford to fly out of the country to be treated elsewhere, because the elite were used to flying out of the country to be treated in South Africa, to be treated in Singapore, to be treated in China. A lot of them are now being held back because of the travel regulations. So what we have seen really is a situation where there's been a lot of repression. We are really worried about the heavy-handedness of the government, where human rights are not respected. Because when we talk about protests, if we go to our constitution, in section 59, the constitution does guarantee that Zimbabweans can petition and demonstrate as long as they are doing it in peace. But what we have seen is a complete, disregard of the constitution. It's like it has been thrown out of the window, and we are having to continue with our life as if we do not have a constitution, which is a sad state of affairs. And I think what is more painful is that as all this is going on, is the continued denial by the government that a crisis exists. So that as well brings in a whole lot of problems, because even as people tried to call out in terms of the situation that we have got, what we have seen is hate language and vitriol being thrust at those individuals and institutions that have tried to speak about the situation.
Thank you for that, Jestina. Much appreciated. Ilaria, could you please take a few minutes to tell us about the Anglophone crisis and the Cameroonian government's war against Boko Haram, and the intersection of the way in which human rights have been respected or not respected in the government's intervention in both crises?
Yeah, sure. Well, Cameroon is facing at the moment multiple and simultaneous crises. You mentioned the Anglophone crisis and the Boko Haram conflict in the far north region, but there's also severe insecurity across the eastern border with Central African Republic, where there are regular raids carried out by car-based rebel groups. And all of this is compounded with a very tense political situation, which is resulting basically in a crackdown on opposition and opposition groups and parties. And all these crises are really threatening the stability of the country, whose economy and whose situation itself has already been put at stake and jeopardized by the global pandemic. At Human Rights Watch, we have been documenting an escalation of attacks by Boko Haram in the far north region of Cameroon. Since the beginning of the year, there have been hundreds of attacks, raids in numerous villages and cities across the border with Nigeria and Chad. And these attacks have indiscriminately and deliberately targeted civilians, including through suicide bombings on IDP camps, and they have resulted in loss of lives, in destruction of property, looting. But Boko Haram has also targeted the military, engaging the military in a continuous battle and fighting. So military barracks, bases have been attacked, soldiers have been killed. So like these are the tactics used by the armed groups to basically wreak havoc in the far north region. And brutal tactics, like for example, using children as suicide bombers. We have recently documented one of these attacks in a village in the far north. When it comes to the Anglophone crisis, and I don't want to spend too much time, maybe we can also leave time for questions, but when it comes to the Anglophone crisis in the northwest and southwest regions, violence has been rife since at least 2017. The crisis began in 2016, but violence really escalated in 2017. We have documented multiple cases of human rights abuses by both sides, by both government forces and armed separatists, and this violence, this continuous fighting has displaced hundreds of thousands of people. The humanitarian situation prevailing in the two English-speaking regions is currently very, very concerning, with over, I think, 700,000 people who had been forced to leave their homes, to live in the bush in very difficult conditions with little access to humanitarian assistance, but in desperate need of humanitarian assistance, but also, displaced in the urban area where they're destitute and they really struggle to cope with this situation. So perhaps I will leave it there and leave more space for questions.
No, thank you for that overview. Very much appreciated. So the U.S. State Department announced on September 2nd of this year a list of sanctions against Mrs. Fatou Bensouda, prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, for efforts to investigate alleged human rights abuses by U.S. military personnel in Iraq and Afghanistan. What kind of ramifications do you fear that this decision by the United States government could have on the struggle for human rights protection across Africa? So I want to turn first to Jestina and then to get your perspective, Ilaria.
Thank you very much for that question. I think this creates a situation where people talk about double standards. Because I think it has been rife in Africa where people are talking about, was the ICC established to put Africa to trial? Because when it goes elsewhere, it seems that it is unacceptable. And I think that then brings a whole lot of challenges if you are having to want to deal with human rights, in particular, where you have crimes against humanity, which are crimes that need to be dealt with by the ICC. But if there seems to be a selective application in terms of who will stand trial, then we have a bit of a problem in relation to that. And rightly so, I think that's an argument that I would also subscribe to, that if we've got a court that's called international, it needs to be addressing situations in all countries without favor or not considering who is where. Because if we are talking about human rights, they're inalienable. It doesn't matter where they are happening. They are still human rights, whether they are in Africa or they are in the US, they are in Iraq, the Middle East, they are still human rights. And I think we need to be seeing that they are being approached in the same way.
Thank you. Ilaria, you want to have a take at that?
Yeah, I mean, like this isn't really my area of expertise, and I would invite anyone who is interested in knowing more about this to read, what we at Human Rights Watch said on our website. But for me, it's clear that the use of sanctions against the International Criminal Court represents a real perversion of these tools. These tools are designed to be used against those who violate human rights and not against an institution dedicated to bringing justice to victims of the worst crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide. And I think we have seen countries that belong to the ICC speaking out to affirm their support for the court's critical mandate, and I think this is very positive. And by the way, last week, Open Society Justice Initiative, alongside with 4 law professors, filed a legal challenge against the US executive order authorizing sanctions against the ICC prosecutor. And I think the challenge was filed in the US federal court. And, you know, at Human Rights Watch, we really look forward to a swift ruling by the court to provide much needed clarity as to, you know, the legality of this executive order. Because, yeah, I mean, it's basically for me a really perverse use of these sanctions devised, again, like for alleged perpetrators of gross human rights abuses, for alleged terrorists, for drug kings, and not for prosecutors seeking, you know, justice for grave international crimes, because the ICC is, at the end, the permanent international body court created to try people accused of genocide, of war crimes, crimes against humanity. But I think it's also a way to perhaps intimidate court officials and staff involved in very critical investigations of the court, but and really send, according to me, a chilling message, because, you know, we cannot rule out the possibility of this executive order having like a broader fallout and a sort of knockdown effect. So I think, yes, it's a very concerning decision that we are watching very closely.
Thank you. So I have a follow-up question for you. As you know, on April 22nd of this year, the Cameroonian government unexpectedly changed its story regarding its responsibility in what has been known since as the Garbo massacre. Does HRW, the Human Rights Watch, endorse the government's conclusions on the Garbo massacre in terms of death toll and the sequence of events that unfolded on that tragic day of February 2020?
Yeah, I mean, as you know, the government initially denied responsibility for this massacre, denied that the army was involved in the killings of 21 people in Garbo, and instead embarked basically in a smear campaign against human rights organizations, including Human Rights Watch and the media. But eventually, following international pressure, including by France, the government admitted that its soldiers bear some responsibility for the killings, which I think was a welcome and positive step. You know, at the same time, and to be clear, we believe that the commission, the findings of the commission of inquiry are flawed, and we have serious concerns over some of the key points of the government investigation, especially with regards to the dynamics of the attack, the timeline of the attack, the number of people killed. But more importantly, I think the commission's findings cut the line of responsibility really far down into the chain of command. They go after low-ranking soldiers. They have arrested, I think, 2 soldiers and a gendarme, and they say absolutely nothing regarding the involvement of the elite unit of the Cameroonian army, the BIR, which our investigation found was also involved in the massacre in Garbo. So I think we have to wait also until the trial starts the 3 members of the security forces have been arrested, we do not think this is enough. We do not think that this means accountability, and especially in light of the limitations of the Cameroonian justice system, trials being held before military courts, trials being held behind closed doors. So we should acknowledge the government's will to find some sort of accountability, but at the same time, we do not think it's enough, and we want accountability to definitely go higher up in the chain of command. Because if this trial and this case is to be an emblematic case and to send a message that human rights abuses committed by security forces are not tolerated, there should be like real accountability, and human rights organizations and media should be allowed to observe the trial, for example, and the government should definitely do more, because, at the end, impunity is still a key driver of the crisis in the Anglophone region, and very few people who have committed abuses have been held accountable for those abuses.
Yeah, thank you for those thoughts. The big question, of course, is whether or not the intent of the government in acknowledging that responsibility is actually to send that kind of message. That authors of similar crimes in the future will be held fully accountable, or whether it's a reaction to international pressure. But I want to move on to another topic, Jestina, and talk a little bit about your arrest and abduction in 2008. In September 2009, as you mentioned, a year after your infamous abduction, the Zimbabwe Supreme Court ordered a stay of your criminal proceedings, a decision that many hailed within the international community as a positive step towards the rule of law within the country. My question to you, do you feel that decision renewed your faith in the quality and the independence of the judiciary institutions within your country? And do you think that legal institutions in Zimbabwe can serve as an effective watchdog against the Zimbabwean government?
It's a mouthful. But at the same time, I also feel that I think just having one case out of many does not really bring a situation where you say your faith has now been rekindled in the system. Because at the time that I was abducted and also detained at the maximum security prison, there was a whole lot of other people as well who went through the same thing that I did. And their cases have not had their day in court. And I think as citizens, they deserve for their cases to be heard in court. Obviously, they will take the precedence from my case, but I think each individual has the right to actually being before a judge and this being cleared of their record. Because as I'm speaking now, the majority of people are just thinking that since Jestina's case was finalized, it also applies to ours. But you never know with systems like the system that we are dealing with at the moment. The situation could be revived later on, and they do not have anything that they can actually show for the case to have been cleared. And also, I think I would want to say what else contributed to my being cleared of the crime against me, which everyone was aware I never committed anyway. I think it was also the campaign globally, where people were talking about the way that I had been abducted, the way that I was being treated by the state. And I think at the same time, I think the backlash that would come every time that I appeared in court with the persecution continuing. I think the government at the time wanted to get rid of that publicity, and it had to come to an end. So those are all issues that contributed to the finalization of that case. But I think when we are looking at our constitution, we have a very progressive constitution finalized in the year 2013. If our constitution were followed to the letter and spirit, I think we would actually be in a better position as Zimbabweans. And the constitution is very clear in terms of the separation of powers between the executive, the legislature, the judiciary. But what we have seen is that no one really can be blamed to have a perception that there is interference with the judiciary from the executive. And I think if we look at the Constitution of 2013, it encourages transparency, even with the appointment of judges, where there are public interviews that happen. But all that is about to be taken away with constitutional amendments that are being proposed, where the issue related to the appointment of judges will now be the preserve of the president. And it's obvious that when a situation like that happens, it means that those people will feel the pressure that they need to respond and also give back where their appointment came from. And my hope and prayer is that these amendments do not go through, because they are really, it's a short circuit in terms of how far we have come to demand accountability, transparency that's attached to the judiciary, and how the judiciary is supposed to be dealing with cases without fear or favor and no selective application of the law. But I think with a lot of the cases that we have looked at in the recent past, we have actually seen that there is more of persecution rather than prosecution of cases.
Thank you for that, Jestina. I want to be mindful of time, so I'm going to start going over the questions we've received for the audience. And the first question is actually for you, Jestina. Are there ever tensions between the framing of the monitoring and reporting done by Western established NGOs on one end and African or Zimbabwean established NGOs on the other?
Sorry, I didn't hear the start of that question.
Sure.
Sorry, Brice.
Yeah, sure. So are there ever tensions between the framing of the monitoring and reporting done by Western established NGOs on one end and African or Zimbabwean established NGOs on the other? Just sort of like a contrast.
When we are talking about NGOs in Zimbabwe, I think the way that we bring out results of our monitoring and documentation, we already come out with a label behind us, a label that we are managed by the West, a label that we are puppets of the West, a label that we are associated with the opposition. So if you are coming out to bring out those abuses, the defense that you will get is that we went to war to guarantee human rights. But then you also ask the question, but what is the difference in terms of the rights that you went out to war to fight for and the rights that we are talking about now? So the tension is there. And obviously we are not seen as a reliable source of information when it comes to human rights abuses. But I think, sadly, government would actually benefit if they saw us as watchdogs, because then they would actually complement the work that we are doing, in the sense that we would be shining beams on where things are happening, especially on human rights abuses, and then they would then be able to act on it, but they see us as enemies. And that creates a bit of a situation. And when we are talking about targeting, we are also talking about targeting of civil society organizations that are actually Zimbabwean civil society organizations. We have had a lot of civil society leaders and their workers actually being detained because of one or the other situation that is brought up.
I think that's a great segue into a question I wanted to ask Ilaria as well. Human Rights Watch has been depicted very often in Cameroon, and I'm sure that's true of several other African countries on which they have been critical with regards to human rights. And Ilaria, as you certainly remember, in 2019, in April 2019, you were denied admission into Cameroon despite having a valid visa. So I guess my question is, how do you account for the decision by officials in Cameroon not to allow you into the country, and how has that affected your ability to do effective work within the country?
Well, I very much agree with what Jestina said regarding governments seeing NGOs and especially human rights groups, but also human rights defenders and media as enemies instead of allies. And they would definitely benefit from the other way around, from seeing us as potential allies and engage in a collaboration with us instead of criticizing us or kicking us out of the country. This is what happened to me last year, and I think this was another tactic used by the government to intimidate people like us who want to shed light on what's happening in Cameroon and to be able to scrutinize government's action, especially in the Anglophone regions, but also elsewhere. We have been trying very hard to engage the government of Cameroon in a constructive dialogue, and we will continue to do so because we believe this dialogue is fundamental. We would like each and every report we publish to reflect the version of the government. We would like the government to tell us what they think about our findings and how they respond to our findings. This is fundamental, and this is the principle which should be behind any meaningful and sound human rights research and investigation. So we will continue to try to dialogue with the government, and we have seen some positive steps which we have to acknowledge. First of all, after I was denied access and other staff from Human Rights Watch, my boss and Central Africa director was allowed into the country at the beginning of this year, and I could meet with some authorities in Yaoundé. Secondly, after the president announced the opening of the investigation into the Ngarbu massacre, he also highlighted the need for the government to collaborate with NGOs. And I think this is really important, and is an important message that should be followed by action. And again, I reiterate the fact that this is not just for human rights groups, but it's also for media, international and national media. They should be allowed to work without hindrance. They should have access to the Anglophone regions, for example. But unfortunately, some journalists have been denied visa. They could not enter the country, and they have been able to work only if embedded with the army in the Anglophone regions, which has advantages and disadvantages, because when you go embedded with the army, you risk basically reporting on only one side of the story.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of that, one of the criticisms that has often been leveled against the organization by the Cameroonian government is a lack of focus on human rights violations committed by separatists or by non-governmental actors. How do you respond to that criticism?
We do respond with our reports, which have documented abuses by both sides. We have shown how separatist groups across the two English-speaking regions have targeted civilians, have enforced the boycott on education, have targeted teachers and students, have practiced widespread kidnappings. We have reported on a series of human rights abuses committed by the separatists. At the same time, I have to say that, especially at the very beginning of the crisis, back in 2016 and 17, when things were yet clear on the ground, it was easier to report on human rights violations committed by government forces because they were pretty identifiable. They were a uniform, and people we talked to could clearly recognize them. They could say, this was a soldier, this was a gendarme, this was a member of the BIR. But when it comes to the separatists, because also their organization is more shaky, it has been, especially at the beginning, it was difficult to report on their abuses. But now they're getting more organized, and some have a clear chain of command. So, when we document some of their abuses, we also engage with them and we ask for a right to reply about what they have to say regarding, this case of kidnapping or like this case of killings. And they seldom respond, but sometimes they do, as the government does.
Thank you. Jestina, you mentioned earlier a number of travel restrictions that have hindered the ability of government officials in Zimbabwe to seek healthcare in other countries, as is very common, not just in Zimbabwe, but in most African countries. Do you think that these unprecedented restrictions on travel stemming from the COVID crisis will usher in more focus on in-country access to healthcare? Are you seeing any evidence of that already happening, or is there any strong prospect that we will head in that direction?
I think because of the challenges that came as a result of the global pandemic, that it was evident that it would be difficult with borders having been closed and flights not moving, that there would be a challenge. We recognize that there were a number of places that were now being prepared for any emergency. And I recall that there was a facility that was actually being prepared for the elite. And when people discovered what was happening, there was an uproar where people were saying, we are going to bring citizens there to see what you are setting up for yourself. So this then exposed what had actually been going on for a long time, because the fact that they were accessing healthcare outside the country, that contributed to them not looking after the healthcare system in the country. And that continued to be a ticking time bomb. And when COVID came in, it just exacerbated the problem and then exposed them that if anything happened, they also did not have a facility in country where they could go and be attended to. But that should not be the situation, because when we are talking about the right to health being respected, it needs to be the right to health of everyone, regardless whether you are the elite or you are the common man in the street. Because I think for years, a lot of Zimbabweans have struggled with the deteriorating health delivery system. So that situation, I would say, probably kind of assisted in terms of focus now being put on the health delivery the health delivery system.
No, thank you for that. One question for you, Ilaria. How do you think trust can be established and institutionalized between Human Rights Watch and countries that are being monitored? Or do you think that the relationship is bound to be conflictual between government authorities and organizations that focus on human rights protection?
I don't think it's necessarily conflictual. I think it could be an honest and open and transparent discussion. I think trust can be established by dialogue. So, and it should be on both sides. If you don't want to dialogue with me, if you don't want to discuss with me, it's perhaps because you have things to hide, or because you do not feel that I will be reporting fairly on what you tell me, or for other reasons. But so far, unfortunately, when it comes to Cameroon, our dialogue with the government has been only on one side, and we have tried to engage, and what we got back was criticism, as I said before, like a smear campaign against Human Rights Watch. They have responded to our findings with very aggressive language and not with responses. They have never provided a response to our findings. They have instead criticized Human Rights Watch, which is not the way you can establish trust. Yeah, I mean, like, I think we should continue to be transparent and to always seek government response to the extent possible. And that's what we, usually do when we write a report. Ahead of publication, we contact the relevant government authorities. It could be the Ministry of Justice, it could be the spokesperson of the army, it could be the presidency itself. And we ask for their take on our findings because we are keen to reflect them. I think it's not lack of will from our side. But I mean, we continue to be optimistic, and we continue to believe in dialogue, and trust. So we will, keep up with our work and continue to engage with the government to the extent possible.
Thank you. One question for you now, Jestina. What kind of relationship exists between human rights organizations that focus on monitoring, like Zimbabwe Peace Project, and organizations that are engaging in direct action and peaceful protest? Is there a great deal of collaboration and synergies between the two?
I think the situation that we have got there is that we hold our mandate where we are able to monitor protests and also ensure that there are no victims who come out of those protests that are supposed to be peaceful. We avoid by all means to have a side that we lean towards, but we seek to be able to monitor and document around what is happening in relation to issues that are related to human rights abuses. So we will be able to talk about what is happening from all across and also call out where human rights abuses do happen.
Thank you. One question for you now, Ilaria. Do you think that the regional human rights institutions, like the African Court or Human and People's Rights, can play a role in fostering or promoting human rights in the continent to such an extent that reliance on the ICC, for example, wouldn't be necessary? I'm just curious to get your thoughts on that.
Sure, I think they do. I think they can play a very important role, and we encourage them to be more proactive on some of the countries we monitor and we research on, such as Cameroon. We would love to see a more proactive role played by the African Union, the African Commission for Human Rights on the situation in Cameroon. What we have seen instead was, I would say, a light engagement with light statements only published when others had done the same. And the same is actually true for other human rights institutions, such as the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which has an office in Yaoundé, and whose mandate is very limited. It doesn't extend to monitoring and reporting, which is a pity, because they have resources that could be used to do exactly that. And so a more proactive and stronger role by human rights bodies across the globe would be very welcomed in Cameroon, in a crisis which really struggles sometimes to make it to the headlines, and especially, well, not to the headlines, I would say, like the crisis in the Anglophone regions has gotten some media attention. What really struggled to get was more attention within international fora, like, for example, the UN Security Council, or international human rights bodies. So you're definitely right that they have a role. They should play a role, and we would like to see this role more prominent.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I have a follow-up question on that, which goes to both you and to Jestina as well. And you can start, Ilaria, and Jestina will wrap it up. Do you think, I guess my question is, if you had a meeting with, let's say, the Secretary General of the United Nations, and were able to basically put in two items of priority for the United Nations or for the international community at large, of the types of pressure that you would like to see exerted on the governments of Cameroon and Zimbabwe, what would those two items, or those two wish list items be in your case? You talked a little bit about the Security Council, and the fact that I think by now they've only had one informal discussion on the situation in Cameroon. Would you like to see that turned into a more formal discussion, a recurrent item on the agenda? Like, what other steps would you like to see taken? Sanctions, perhaps? What would be helpful?
Yeah, you already mentioned two of our main asks. The first one is to move Cameroon to the UN Security Council formal agenda as a very important item for the Security Council to discuss, and not just the humanitarian situation, but also the human rights crisis. So seeing Cameroon at the formal agenda of the UN Security Council, that would be a very important first step to give more attention to this crisis, and to take meaningful step to find also long-lasting solution for the Anglophone crisis, and also for the multiple crises unfolding in the country. And the second one, indeed, is sanctions. Targeted sanctions like asset freeze or travel ban for those responsible for human rights abuses, both from the government forces, but also from the armed separatists. These sanctions would actually work perfectly for some of the leaders of the separatist movement, whom are mostly based outside Cameroon, and are fueling the violence by funding and feeding the armed groups on the ground. But the same is true for those government officials who have ordered or who are responsible for the numerous and widespread human rights abuses that Human Rights Watch and other organizations have documented over the years in Cameroon. So, like, the second ask is really linked to justice and accountability. Accountability for the most serious crimes, which have been documented by many, and justice for the victims of those crimes and their families.
Thank you. How about you, Jestina? In the case of Zimbabwe, what steps would you like to see the international community take to address those?
I think in the same light of what Ilaria has said, I think it's important for the UN to be engaged. I think when in the last few weeks, we saw the UN Secretary General write a statement in relation to the respect of human rights in Zimbabwe, how that should really be respected. But I think it needs to go beyond that, because I think when you look at the Zimbabwean situation, we have had conflict after conflict. And what we probably would want to ask for is full investigations into some of the issues that have taken place. At the moment, we have situations with abductions, where the narrative that is coming from government is basically to say that the abductions are fake and people are inflicting them, self-abducting and self-torturing. I think both the UN and the AU have special rapporteurs who could assist with investigations in those cases. Because it seems these things just happen. People are severely tortured. They suffer trauma and they continue to have that trauma piled on them because no one really is interested in terms of investigation and finding out exactly what happened. I think we spoke about my situation. Even when it was something that was publicized, no one was made to account for what they did. So with such impunity, it means that that will continue. Last year, we had some special rapporteurs coming into the country. And I think what we really need to have is rapporteurs that will be able to look at various sectors within the country so that we are able to all of us get to an understanding of where we are. And as Zimbabweans, we also believe that there is need for pressure to be applied for broad-based, inclusive dialogue to take place. Zimbabweans need to find each other so that we are able to talk to each other, because what is happening at the moment is a lot of vitriol that goes on, and as a result, it kind of spoils everything that needs to be forward-looking and also putting the victim at the center of the crisis that we have got in the country.
Thank you, Jestina. Sorry, I was having some internet connection issues. Thank you so much, Ilaria and Jestina, for this very thoughtful and engaging conversation. We thank the audience as well for taking the time. We hope that you found this conversation as enriching as I have. Look, stay tuned for more events that will be brought to you by HALA and the Africa Policy Journal. Thank you and have a great day, everybody.